Get started here. I'll do a real quick introduction to what the weekend workshops are. Of course, you guys know about them because you're here right now, but Adam and myself run the Columbus Web Group. We do monthly meetups. We just had one this week, and it was 3 different topics, wide range of topics. So it was responsive images, micro interactions, and future of JavaScript. So it was about ECMA 2015. And that was our last meetup of this year. So in January is our next one. It's going to be really, really awesome. It's by a creative director who's over at Resource, Todd Novak. And he's going to be talking about finding inspiration inside yourself and how you can be better as a designer, as a creative, or really anyone inside this field. So we have meetups that are about methodologies, best practices, approaches, trying to inspire people. And then because we're kind of more holistic, high level, we started doing weekend workshops that are more targeted to teaching people on a single topic and making sure that we're putting the classes and the course together about the people that sign up. So all of you should have received my email. I believe I received a response from everyone. So I tried to make this course, which is Intro to CSS and HTML, really targeted to you guys and what you wanted to learn. But over this weekend and next Saturday, I really want you guys to try to get as much of this as possible. So making this more about a conversation, and feel free to interrupt, ask questions, feel comfortable doing that. Like if you break my train of thought and I forget something, well, then it probably wasn't that important, and we can just move on to another conversation. So don't ever feel like you're disrupting. I kind of want that to be the environment that we have here, and as much feedback as possible, or if we need to dive in deeper, we can always do that. And I'm also available to meet after this class, or if you want to call, text me, or email me. I can always find time to also help you guys out. So it's not just this day and next Saturday, anything in between. Feel free to use me as a resource because I want you guys to learn. So my name's Kevin Mack. Adam and I run the Columbus Web Group. I've been started development in '95. Was also a print designer at one point. Done a lot of design work, and over really the past maybe 12 years professionally, I've moved to focusing on building interfaces and being on the front end side of things. I'll kind of explain what a front end developer is, but really focusing on interfaces, so designing and developing interfaces for large scaling applications. And by that I mean it could be a native application to a web application to a website. So I have a crazy amount of experiences working with front-end, HTML, CSS, and also designing interfaces for user experiences. So I love to geek out about this stuff. So as I mentioned, I surveyed or sent out an email to all of you, and I said, what do you want to get out of this class? So this is kind of like the breakdown. Are you looking for something?
I'm looking for an outlet.
Yeah, the outlets are a little limiting, and even if you're plugged in, it may not seem like it's working. But yeah, sorry about that. Oh, and the Wi-Fi's on the board here too. And we're recording this, so hopefully this comes through, and we have a playback of it. Is that record button? I forgot. I don't remember if it's record. There's a little red record button. Okay, cool. Adam's never recorded this, so hopefully he doesn't screw it up too much. But so this is kind of what I heard from you, and it was actually a really interesting group, and sometimes we have a wide range of responses. We may have someone that's been developing or designing, and the topic is like more of an introduction, and we have someone that's like an expert. And with our weekend workshops and the different classes that we do, it's really good to have that wide range of people, but it seems like the majority of you are designers or UX folks, and some of you work in marketing and agencies and have little to some experience. Some of you are a little bit more experienced with HTML and CSS, and then there's one data nerd, which is Kyle here. But it seemed like, where everyone is, you're kind of at the same level, but trying to get out of this class the same things, which is a better understanding of CSS, HTML, improving communication, and that can be then even with like recruits or people that you're interviewing, but team members, whether you work in an environment that has developers or you're hiring people to work on some of your projects, or just trying to figure out terms. And then the basic understanding of how CSS and HTML works. And then really trying to understand how if you see something, how you can make it. And then understanding how something was made and how you can dissect it and figure out how I can do this on my own. Actually, a couple of people said that they would just want to be a better designer. And then also heard that people were looking for potential new jobs or maybe potential raises in their jobs and how they could be better overall as an employee. So I hope we get everything covered in this class. And again, like if there's something that we're not covering, please ask and we can add it to the agenda. So just looking at this, am I missing anything? Does it sound right? This is like this time where you're supposed to speak up and make some friends here. I know it's early in the morning. I've been up for hours, so I don't know about you guys. So here's kind of the outline of what we'll be doing. And I've done this class before, but again, it's kind of custom to the group that we have, and I've been mentoring some other people. So some of the content's shared or borrowed from that. But this is kind of targeted to this group right here. And these are kind of the sections that we'll be covering. And in the past, it was kind of more presentational, me, Chatty Cathy up here. But I want this to be a little bit more hands-on this time around and talking more about the code as opposed to presentation. But I still want to do some introduction stuff about holistic views of HTML, CSS, and development. So we'll talk about team dynamics today, web development at a high level, syntax for HTML and CSS, inheritance, specificity, dev tools. And that's really going to be our first day. And then the next day, next weekend, we're going to, I'm going to suggest some homework if you guys want to do some homework, or at least dive into it a bit, and we can do a quick review of it and start with that next week too. But it'll be covering some of the topics that we have from today. And then next week, we'll get into some of the methodologies. We'll probably even touch on some of them today, or you'll be seeing them, but they may not make sense. But it's really about the way of naming conventions work for writing quality code. And then we'll get into positioning of structures, creating positioning things in HTML and CSS, which is one of the fundamentals of building an interface. And then we'll talk about some of those modern topics that are out there that are more for conversation. We're not going to dive too deep into them, but like building an interface that is contextually based, as well as what responsive web design is, and kind of crafting your code that way. But again, there's going to be other classes that are on responsive web. I just feel like it's definitely related to this. And then project process and how people work together, but really talking about the role of the designer, developer, and how they collaborate, work together. And if there's time, I like to throw in atomic design, which is one of my favorite methodologies, and it kind of wraps up everything together. Sound good? Are you guys bored yet? Because you're going to be. But, all right, so getting into team dynamics. And this is something, I feel like I've shared this with some of you in this room because I've met some of you. And if I haven't said hi to you yet this morning, when we take a break, please let's chat and let's hang out maybe afterwards. But team dynamics, this is just an overview of how teams work, especially how it relates to front end. So for myself, I see front end as really an umbrella. And these are the people that are writing the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So on one spectrum, there's the UI developer, and this is more like myself. So the person that's crafting the interfaces, they're not necessarily a designer, but they're writing the HTML, CSS, and they're really up on their accessibility and the craftsmanship of code, the latest specs, what's happening in the web, just a pulse on the latest trends, high level of that. And then on the other spectrum, there's the application architect, and sometimes the word engineer is thrown in there, but this is kind of the full spectrum, the UI to application architect. This is someone that's really heavy on the JavaScript side, like your MVC frameworks, just knowing all the latest trends. We're not really going to get too much into this, but I just bring this up here to talk about the front end spectrum. So when people say front end, like there's a full spectrum to it. And a lot of people have this misperception, like front end, like we're going to hire a front end developer. Well, he needs to know HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And it's like, okay, this guy knows HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And then I interview someone, and it's like, oh, they're really great at writing JavaScript, but they can't build an interface or understand a design concept to save their lives. and they're different roles. So that's why I like to bring this up. And really this course is focusing more on the UI side and the interface side, and really how that relates to design and the process with it. And then kind of carrying this through, and this isn't necessarily a full spectrum, but user experience. So I work at Cardinal Solutions. I haven't said that yet. I'm on our user experience team, so I'm a UI dev. And the UX is an umbrella. So how many of you have heard of the UX umbrella? Cool. So in the UX umbrella, I can draw on the board because I think it's funny. And I actually I hate that people refer to it as the UX umbrella, because to me it's just like a grouping of different things. But it looks something like this. So we have user research. I hope this is not a Sharpie. All right, so we have user research. We have usability. We have content strategy. This is not something like, is there a G in that, content strategy? There's information architecture. Am I forgetting here? There's visual designer and interactive designer. Wow. This says interactive designer. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I feel like I'm missing one of them. But we also, at Cardinal, we add in UI dev, and a lot of people do add this inside here. So this is actually something, if you Google search UX umbrella, this actually exists out there. And then someone always puts it inside of this really dorky umbrella. And anytime I see this like on a slide deck, I like gag and die a little bit inside, but that's why I put it on here. And then you have to do that's the handle that you hold. And then it's probably like raining over here because no one understands what UX is. So this is the UX umbrella. So these are different roles and different aspects of it. And for the front-end developer, they're really focused. They're outside UX. Some UI developers are outside of it. Some of them have overlap. But the difference is the people that are doing other spectrums from the UX umbrella. So a lot of UI devs are still doing like user research, definitely up on usability. They should be involved with IA as well as, or information architecture as well as content strategy. So really the holistic view of how the application is going to be coming together, and working very closely with the interactive designer and visual designer. So that's why I put it up there. The UI developer is usually not a visual designer, but they can be. That's what like Jared Spool refers to as like the unicorn. It's very difficult to reach that spectrum of being visual designer and developer. But being a good designer, you should be knowing what development is and like the limitations and capabilities of the different systems and platforms that you're working with. But if you can just know some of it and still develop, you're going to be a better designer. And taking the time to learn the basics, you could still do some projects on your own, but you probably won't be like the lead UI architect and still be the lead visual designer. And if you do have both capabilities, I would highly recommend not taking on both roles and responsibility in a project, because one side's going to win over the other. That's my own personal opinion on that. Last side of this is the back-end developer, and they do stuff that's boring, but it's like your PHP, Java, .NET, list goes on, building databases, huge craftsmanship on the system and how the whole application comes together. I joke about back-end developers a lot because the majority of my friends are back-end developers. And as a front-end person, you have to work very closely with your back-end developer, as well as a designer does too, which I think a lot of people get confused by that, because I believe all team members should be working in parallel and working together to build better applications. So that's my spectrum. Any questions on that? Does that make sense? Cool. So just a little bit more chatting up here from me, and then we'll get into stuff. So what is a website? A website, I like to break it down into really three main pieces. And the first one is content, which that is one of those stupid things to put up there. But I can't explain, or I can't even put it into words how frustrating it is, how many times I've been on projects and we're like 3 months in and we had the conversation with the client. It's like, what's the content going to be? Well, we're still gathering that. And it's like, okay, well, we have this deadline that's December 1, so we need to start design and development. And then like 2 weeks before like the project's over, they're like, here's my content. And it's like something that you didn't expect. And you just build an interface that doesn't work for the content that they have. And then people get upset. They're like, well, now I have to redesign it. I have to redevelop it. This isn't going to work for me. So that's why I say content is the most important piece. And that's why websites exist. That's why people are going to your websites. They're not going there to see necessarily a great interface. Hopefully they are, but they're going there for the content. And having that content be up front and building your interfaces and your designs around the content is incredibly crucial for building like a sustainable system that's going to be flexible. So we'll be talking about like stress tests with HTML and content and building interfaces for variable flexible content. And then of course UI, which is user interface. Everyone's familiar with that term, right? I say UI a lot. Okay, so user interface, which again is the pieces that people are interacting with. And then I say UX, which is this, this umbrella. So it's not just the visual design, it's not those micro interactions, it's not the overall fun parts of it, the things like make it fun, make it pop. It's the overall experience. So it's how these three come together. There are a lot of other aspects for it, but for this course, I think this is a good breakdown for like what a website is and as we talk about it. And then where do websites live? And I bring this up just because we'll be talking about some of these things, and I just want to have this baseline. This is a really great graphic by Luke Rabusky from lukew.com. He's amazing. If you guys don't know him, definitely read his blogs and follow him, just lukew.com. And this was a graphic he made. It's now years old. I can't even remember. I would say it's maybe from 2013. And this is just kind of this graphic that shows everything in the modern digital landscape for web. So small devices, large devices, and then where it gets really cool, and it may be kind of hard for you to see, but right here it says palm, lap, desk, and then these different gestures and different input types. So it's the way that people are interacting with these types of devices, and then how there's different capabilities or contextual factors that are out there, and just a highlighting of different inputs, so cursor versus keyboard. And I feel like this just gives this nice overview and makes you think about when I'm designing, building an interface, what do I need to be building this for? I need to be building for someone that's using it in their hand on their smartphone. I need to be building it for someone that's on the desktop. I need to be building it for someone that's touching with it. So making sure my clickable areas are those 40 pixels by 40 pixels for the traditional index finger size. Making sure that if gestures or touch devices is part of my interface, what's the fallback if that's not available? So there's these different pieces that are happening in parallel, as well as like hard facts like screen size. But I think this does a great summary of like the digital landscape, and it's not just really talking about screen dimension, but other contextual factors out there. This graphic now could be a lot bigger, but I still think it highlights a lot of things when relating to the interface. And then the classic, who are websites for? Who are websites for? What was that? Users. And then just blah, blah, blah. Just highlighting some things I like to always say, and I like a broken record, but users want to be connected. They want consistent experiences. So this is really big when building an interface. And as we get into the code, not just creating single-use selectors or single-use single-use selectors in your CSS, but making your code be scalable and reusable is the right way of building an interface. And it's how you can create these consistent experiences from small screens to big screens, is reusing the code that you wrote, not rewriting code and just adding a different name for it and being like, all right, now this, I forgot that I made this in the past. So it's the way that you craft it to get consistent experiences, and that's going to be one of like the big highlighting pieces as we dive into the code. All right, any questions about that? Because there's a short little video. Is one of my favorite videos too. All right, so Harry Roberts is kind of a leader in the front end world. He's an amazing presenter. His website's fantastic, and he puts out content that it's just awesome. So really hits a home run with the way that you should be crafting and building interfaces and writing your front end code. So this is a little video that he did at a conference talking about one of his methodologies, which is called ITCSS or ITCSS, which stands for Inverted Triangle CSS. And I think this little snippet is really awesome because he highlights some of the frustrations that I hear, see, and have discussions about the front end world. Because one of the worst things about HTML and CSS is everyone thinks they know how to write HTML and CSS. And that's because the learning curve is very small and you can learn it. Like by the end of this class, you can be like, I know how to write HTML and CSS, even though I never have written HTML and CSS. But understanding how to do it correctly, very few people do. So I think this video highlights a lot of it. And he's awesome. Let me dim the lights.
What did you say that graphic that blog was from?
Oh, Luke W. So Luke Robuski. It is a crazy name to spell. If you just search Luke W, you'll find it. Lube? Lube? Yeah, no. That's a different meetup. All right.
Has anyone worked on a product where the CSS has got really hairy? You know, it's got just, oh, who did this? Why did you do this? That happens on almost any project, but it gets a lot worse when we start writing large products, when we start writing large UIs. Now, there are a lot of problems with CSS. CSS is terrible, which is why I've managed to make a living out of writing it. If it was easy, I wouldn't have a job. But there are two main camps, right? Two main divides I find in the problems with CSS. There are things that CSS gets wrong, and CSS fundamentally makes some mistakes. But we as developers get things wrong all the time. We do some really silly things with CSS. So there are two broad categories. There are things that CSS gets wrong. There are things that we get wrong. Looking at things that are potentially CSS's fault, the first one seems like the weirdest, the cascade and inheritance. Now that's a key foundation of how CSS works. It's one of CSS's biggest features. But I'm sure you've worked on a code base where you've edited a rule here, and it's just broken something on a page like 100 clicks away. That's because CSS operates in this global namespace where everything cascades and inherits, and every bit of CSS has got the potential to affect something else. It can't be fully encapsulated. So the cascade and inheritance is a really leaky, horrible way of working at scale. It's very loose. So CSS is nice and easy to learn, which is good. You can just view source and a beginner can pick up how to write CSS. That's really nice for the web, but it's not nice for developers, mature developers. You can't write CSS in strict mode. There isn't a way of turning on a strict version of CSS. So it's really easy to do nasty things with CSS, and that can be the developer's fault, and it's also CSS's fault for allowing it. It's very highly dependent on source order. Right? I mean, a lot of languages are, but CSS is very highly dependent on source order because things cascade in a certain way, and I'm sure you've tried moving a rule set around a style sheet, and it's broken everything. So even just moving existing CSS around can break a lot of stuff, so we need a way of managing source order effectively. It's not very expressive. It's a really dull, boring syntax. You know, color, colon, red. It's just boring and dull. But as a result, it doesn't tell much of a story. When you try and read someone else's CSS, it's very hard to understand what they were achieving. It's not very expressive at all, which is why we should probably write more documentation. Lots of gotchas. There are some just frankly weird things in CSS that we just can't avoid. CSS is just bizarre. And I've saved the best to last. Specificity. Specificity is the worst aspect of CSS because it doesn't matter what cascades to where or what order you've written things in. Specificity can undo everything. Who's ever had like problems with specificity on a project? You know, selectors that are way too specific.
So there's probably terms in there that you have no idea what they mean, but we'll be covering those. And he really does highlight the main issues with CSS and like where it goes wrong. So a lot of things inside there, if it didn't make sense or you're confused, watch your eyes. There we go. It's Harry Roberts. Why, Siri, did you even do that? So he goes by the name CSS Wizardry, and that's his website. All right, so we're going to do some CSS HTML syntax. So I'm going to actually be opening up CodePen. And one of the conversations, or I feel like a lot of people ask me, was like, well, what do I come installed with on my machine? For today, we're going to just be working in CodePen. CodePen's pretty awesome. And then afterwards, if we want to move into an IDE or text editor, we'll do a quick little survey and see how, if we want to move outside of just using a browser editor. So let me get this set up. Is everyone having fun? Cool. My lips are really chapped. I don't know why. Oops. I was looking for that. Hey, Adam. Did that go away, or does this look fine on there? Can you see my cursor going here to here? All right, give me a second. How about now? You can see left corner, bottom right corner. Cool. Awesome. Oop. All right, so CodePen's pretty awesome. And it's a place that I use a lot to kind of share with team members like stuff that I'm working on, as well as like mentoring classes and things I'm doing. So I have a couple of my pens up there that I've done. So a lot of, you can't see that? Give me 1 second. Oh, Adam. Resource to kind of see what people are doing, get sample code. It's kind of like the dribble of the front-end dev world. So the same way that you may want to go out there and find inspiration, you can go to CodePen and do a search and be like, oh, how did someone do this? So you can kind of go out there. And everything that we're doing today, I'll be sharing with you guys afterwards. And I'll be sending notes out too. Do any of you guys use Slack? You guys like Slack? Does anyone here not like Slack? How many people don't know what Slack is? All right, so I'm wondering if we create a Slack channel for this so we can share and kind of have conversation, then we can abandon it in a couple weeks if we want to. So I can send instructions on that unless someone really does not like that idea. Slack is just another like a messenger type thing that's out there. It's really good for collaborating and sharing stuff with people. One of these. All right, cool, fantastic. All right, we're gonna start off over here, and let me know if you're struggling to see this. I may want to darken this actually. I feel like this projector has gotten lighter over the year. Oh, no, that did exactly opposite of what I wanted here. Is that better-ish? Yeah. And you guys can see that? So it looks like a bunch of F's and D's. All right, so at the top is going to be my HTML, and over here is going to be my CSS. You will notice that it says SCSS, which is the file extension for a Sass, which Sass is a CSS pre-compiler. I write primarily in Sass. We will also have future Columbus Web Group weekend workshops on Sass, but I'm going to try to avoid not writing in Sass. So if I catch myself, if anyone's familiar with Sass at all, just be like, hey, you're writing in Sass, and I'll pull back. Because today we're just talking about CSS. So looking at just the CSS side, to get started, to create a class, you would do something like this, like selector, and then you have these curly brackets. So this is what you would refer to as a class. or as a selector, and a class. So having a period means it's a class. I can have multiple classes. I can have like class 2, class 1, class 2. God, class 2. So these are a grouping of different selectors, and they're all classes. So this is class selector, class 1, class 2. And then inside this, you have these curly brackets. And this is where you actually put the CSS properties that you're going to be applying to your code. So an example of this would be color, red. So this is a property, and then this is the value of the property. So you always have your selectors at the top, these curly brackets, and then a property and a value, and they're separated by a colon, and you end with a semicolon. In majority of computer languages, you end with a semicolon. Some of the compiled languages don't require it. Some different, like stylists, you don't need to do it. If you're using traditional Sass, not SCSS, you don't need it. But this is what CSS looks like. So the traditional setup for CSS is like this. So these are multiple classes. But if you just wanted one, it would be something like this. So this would be the name, the custom name I made. And you can make your selectors as long as you want. I would not recommend calling it something like that. That'd be just stupid. In addition to classes, you have what are referred to as IDs. So this would be my selector name. And a selector is just, it's what you refer to your class. So it's what you're going to be applying the properties. So what you're selecting in your HTML to apply the styling or the properties that you have. So an ID, and I'll talk about what an ID is as we get into the code. You do it as the pound or hash. So this is hash selector name, but this is an ID selector. There's a handful of many amazing selectors out there. I can also do attribute selectors, so something like data state is equal to true, and apply stylings to that. So pretty much anything inside my HTML, and I'll be showing you some HTML here in a second, I can use a selector to select them. One of the websites that I highly recommend and reference a lot, and it's kind of old, but it's not out of date because CSS hasn't really had too many major changes. So from when CSS came around, it's evolved and it's made it a lot better for developing code and especially interfaces. CSS 3 was a huge jump in CSS, and this latest spec that's coming out, which is the level 4 CSS, is going to have some additional selectors that are really powerful. But if you're looking at a book about CSS and selectors from the past, it's pretty much the same. People have just been writing CSS and HTML wrong for many years. So you can go to this site, and I'll be sending this out. This is the 30 CSS selectors you must memorize. And I always reference this, and I tell people to check this out. This is a really great resource. And it just goes over some of the most commonly used CSS selectors. It gives you this browser compatibility and breakdown. So the big thing about CSS and definitely HTML5 is not all the elements, the selectors, the properties, the stylings that you have in your CSS are compatible with all browsers. So you may need a reference, be like, can I use this? Can I not use this? And this is just kind of nice to see where this is available.
Super question.
Yeah.
That Microsoft has Edge that they're trying to
Yeah.
What are you finding compatibility?
Microsoft, it says they support a lot of things, but then they really don't. Edge is supporting some of the newest properties as well for JavaScript and CSS, kind of even ahead of Chrome, which is interesting. One of my biggest issues with IE is their support for Flexbox and some of the newer CSS structure stuff because they kind of have their own interpretation of it. But Edge is actually pretty good. And different browsers, like Microsoft was the king of doing this in the past. Safari's now doing it a lot. They create proprietary properties that only work inside their browser. So like a styling or a treatment of how an experience may be that will only work in Edge or may only work in IE or may only work in Safari. Chrome doesn't really have those really because they fork over WebKit. So different browsers have different capabilities and styles. I don't know if I jumped around on that question, but Edge is not too bad. Another great resource is caniuse.com. And if you're looking for things like, can I use box shadow? I type that in here, and you can see all the browser support inside here. And the green means, yeah, it's supported. Red means not supported. But no one cares about IE8 anymore. And these are the most common browsers that are out there. And Edge, Firefox, and Chrome in Safari. Safari's been a little bit, Safari's like the new IE in my mind, but, and iOS Safari's been a little buggy in the latest release, but these have updates that are always happening that you may not realize. So unless like you're working in an environment where your help desk or IT department prevents updates, you're getting updates to support latest releases from CSS and HTML without you even realizing it. And the really cool thing about the web, and especially CSS and HTML and JavaScript, is it's all open source. So browsers, how they render and how they actually work, it's been open source from the beginning. Anyone can be a part of it. Like, even if you're not a developer or a designer, you're just like someone that's like, I wonder if the browser could ever do this. You can participate and kind of lobby different ideas and be like, this is what a browser needs, or this is what we need to have available. So in some of my free time, I work on some of the specs and drafts for future enhancements to the browsers. I was part of the responsive images community, which is the responsive issues community that worked on the picture element, source set, and now we're working on element query or the container query, which will be really awesome for responsive. But the cool thing about it is there's some features, and especially on like the design side, that have come out that it's hard to keep up on them, but they may change the way that you think about a design or building your interface. And hopefully you just are keeping your eyes and ears open for those, and you're working with someone that has that pulse for it. But this website and Can I Use, I reference them all the time. This is something, we're not going to dive into every single selector here, but we're going to be covering some of them out there throughout this course. But this is one of those things I was going to recommend that you guys take a peek at as homework and come with questions, because some of them are kind of crazy selectors, but I use a lot of these, but I kind of stay more true to traditional CSS just because of browser support. So different selectors, it also relates to the browser support that you have and the way that you craft your HTML and CSS. So back on track. Now looking, so that's the CSS site. Anyone have any questions about just syntax of CSS? And let me do this. So let's do selector name, curly brackets, and then we'll say background color yellow. And then let's do main border 20 pixels solid red. So you can have multiple selectors in a CSS file. Ideally, you only have one. You don't have like a new CSS file for every single module or piece of your interface. You have one that you're kind of maintaining, because there's, and just because they can get kind of large, and the more files that you have out there, especially from CSS, HTML, and images, the more requests that you have to your server, the slower your website is actually going to be for loading. So you want to minimize and have the least amount of requests to download files and kind of optimize for that. So you do all your styles primarily in one CSS file. The extension for it is .css. That's the one thing that's hard to talk about while working in CodePen, is that it kind of does that magic for me. So it's pairing this CSS file to here. But a traditional HTML file would look something like this. We have the HTML tag, we have a head tag, and then we have the body tag. Every HTML document starts with this. Any server-side language that's rendering inside the browser as a website has this included in it. So whether you're using .NET, PHP, Java, if you're any compiled language, anything out there, this is what you're seeing when you go to a browser. And we're going to talk about Chrome developer tools and kind of using that. But if you inspect anything on the page, this is always there. The cool thing about HTML5 is you don't need to include this anymore, but I would highly recommend doing it. And because the browser will interpret a blank .html file or .whatever, any file extension that you can open up in the browser, it's going to interpret it as having an HTML tag as a head, as a body. And the reason why they have that is it's what's referred to as directives, and there's also shadow DOM elements that are out there, so including another file inside another file, so you don't need to have two HTML files. The browser's smart enough to actually do that for you. That's a side story. But this is the basic structure. And what this is referred to is DOM. So I will say DOM a lot. And that stands for document, I forgot what the D stood for, but document object model. And it's based in this node base. So when I say node, it's talking about these elements. So XML is a node-based language, and it's the basis of kind of programming languages, especially HTML. So we have this DOM tree. We have HTML, head lives inside HTML, body lives inside HTML. Body is the sibling of head, and that's kind of the node tree inside of it. I write and put all my code inside of body. So if I'm writing any HTML at all, it goes inside here. So I'm going to write hello world, and we'll see this come up here. That was really slow update. And that's kind of like a basic HTML page. So if you're like, I wonder what an HTML file would be, that's all you need. You just need to save it with an extension of .html, and then you can open up in the browser. Inside your head, you'll have different things like your title tag. So this would be what the page is actually being called. So inside like the browser, you see like this, a pen by Kevin Mack. This is your title tag. So I could say like butts. And then if I actually save this out and load it in a page, you'd see butts up in the tab. There's other metadata that I can add inside here, and the metadata is like for SEO purposes, for search engines, different ways that browsers may want to render your application or website. So there's a bunch of different things. We're not going to get too much into it. But the important thing is that you would put your link rel equal to style sheet and this href, and then the reference to your CSS file. So wherever it may be inside your document. So styles.css. And let me talk about this for a second. So this is an HTML tag. We have link, we have rel, which is an attribute, and we have href, which is an attribute. So those are referred to as attributes. Anything that's inside of an element or an HTML tag is referred to as an attribute. So when I say attribute, this is this. Earlier, I talked about the data state equal to be true. That is an attribute. I can also do a selector that is just looking at anything that has an attribute of data state, but then I can also say when it's equal to a value. So the value of these attributes, rel, is style sheet. The attribute for href is styles.css. And what I want to do for CSS and HTML, so this was a file that was saved on my computer. I forgot I wrote butts. I have like the short-term memory problem this morning, but believe it or not, I had some drinks last night. And I would have a reference to where my CSS file is relative to my HTML file. So it would be path to, I don't know, styles. So this would be if I had something like a root, and a root is just your base directory of where your files live. And then I have a folder or another directory that's called path to styles. And then inside there, I have a file that has an extension of .css, and then it includes my styles in that file. It's called styles.css. So this is relative to the path of where your HTML file is. And then all my code in HTML and DOM, additional DOM, lives inside of body. This is the basics of all HTML and CSS. And then the other call out, if you're having script files or JavaScript, you'd want to put these down here. So, and this is just kind of best practices to put it at the bottom because of how the DOM tree renders and how JavaScript is making references to your DOM, and it's best to have it at the end, and also for the for the loading of it. So this is what a basic DOM tree would look like, and it breaks down this way. Any questions about that before moving on?
Are you using some kind of shortcut to?
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. So this is using a Zen code, and I highly recommend it. It's really, really nice. So if I type the word link and I hit tab, it writes that in for me. I'm just really good at typing magically. Yeah, so it adds different things. Like if I do an unordered list and I hit tab, it's like, boom, it added all that content for me. Or if I wanted to do like lorem 20, boom, 20 words of lorem. But you always have to say boom afterwards. I don't know what that is. I don't think I've ever said boom before in my life. Adam says bam a lot. Bam. Do they? Does he? I mean. Oh yeah. So.
What is that's what I've always wondered.
Yeah. So that.
What needs to go in a separate line? What goes in the same line? Why do you break it? Like, what's the logic behind all that?
No, that's a great question. So it's just different formatting. Different developers have a different way of formatting. I would recommend sticking to a style. I don't know if this has an actual name to it, but this is pretty traditional where you have like a wrapper and then you do a tab indent or you do spaces indent. So different projects may do like 4 spaces as opposed to a tab in. I usually set my editors to do a tab because I like how it looks, but it's going to be different and it's based off your team and the formatting. But traditionally you have, again, like looking at DOM, we have HTML, we have head, and then anything that's a child to a parent, you want to indent it. And I even do that on different like inline attributes just because I like how to read it. It makes it a little bit cleaner. So it's just all about legibility. And the big thing is just consistency between your teams. I've worked on projects where people just have it like all next to each other, and it makes it really difficult. You have to like do all this searching for it, but that's really why you do that. You just indent it in. Did you say that sucks?
No, so that makes sense.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. All right, so because I'm using CodePen, you can imagine that I'm working inside the body now. So the body tag. One of the first things that I like to do is, let's talk about, actually related to your question too, I'm going to show you one quick thing. So, and it's related to this. This is a bug that comes up, and even like very senior front-end developers run into this and they don't realize it. It's an interesting one. I'm just going to add some really quick styling on here. And actually, I don't want to do this yet, but I'll. Whoop. And if I'm ever moving too fast, which I'm just trying to show a quick example here, please tell me to slow down. All right, so we have 1, 2, 3, right? And these are spans. These are just tags. These are traditionally used for inline elements. So an inline element is like if I have lorem 3, and I wanted to apply some kind of styling to ipsum, I can add this wrapper around it. So this tag, this element around here. So if I wanted to do some styling for it, I could. So spans are traditionally used for inline elements, especially on text. They're really, really helpful. The spans and divs are probably the most used. I would say 95% of your code. That's not true, but it's somewhere around there. But I bring this up related to Cameron's question here. We have span, we have 1, 2, 3. Now, watch what happens when I backtrack and make these all on one line. We have 1, 2, 3. So even though these are elements that are next to each other, and you would think that it would be smart enough to like space it, this is where actually like your elements, you want to have at least one space in between touching elements. Because if not, you could have an output like this. And this happens in really bad WYSIWYGs. So WYSIWYGs are like what you see is what you get. It's the same way that you format like your Google emails or anything out there has some styling, formatting stuff related to it, and how they handle like unordered lists or list items. So we have this 1, 2, 3, and then if we imagine that this was a list element here, and I just remove some of the styling from it. Oh. So we'll see these. This now, 1, 2, 3. And then you see how they're spaced out really nice, but they're in this unordered list. But if I remove those, it becomes like this weird like spacing. So it doesn't render it the same. But that spacing in between, if I have 1, 2, 3, it's the same as that. So it's kind of hard to see that. But I just bring that up because that does actually commonly come up. And like every once in a while, I'm like, why is that spacing? Why can't I get that? Why is there like a random space between these elements, or why are they so close together? And it's because like 2 DOM elements are touching each other. Cool. All right. So one of the first things when starting off an interface and building is I like to start with the star selector, so this guy. And what he does is he looks at everything inside the DOM tree, from HTML to body to anything that's nested or a child of body, which is pretty rad. So I'm just going to create a couple divs inside here and kind of show you how this works. And we'll be talking about Chrome Developer Tools. Cool. So in H1, it stands for header. Header 1, there's H1 through H6s. They have different contexts of use cases. You can look them up. You can do a Google search, and like any developer, if you have questions, you can say H1 and see what you get for that. H1, W3 Schools isn't the best resource, but it's good for a quick reference. W3.org is better. The Mozilla is really good. But any of these resources are probably going to be what you need for this. Let's look at the W3.org version of it. And it gives you some examples of it. And then it tells you the use cases for it, which is pretty cool. So different elements are used in different contexts based around the content that you're using. That may sound confusing, but it's just you're using different HTML tags based off of different content. So the reason why I would use an H1, and I should only have like one H1 for a page, would be like my page title. So this is my page my page title, and this is just saying what my page is. Now, if I had something like a div here, it's still my page title, that content's still available, but I'm not getting the benefits that I need. So I use an H1 because it gets recognized by from the search engines to scan and say, oh, this is my page title. And it's also a reference for accessibility reasons, like for screen readers, to reference that I'm on this page. So using the correct elements and tags are definitely important, and it does take time to learn which ones to use. The important ones to take away right now would probably be your H1s through H6s. And they kind of go down in hierarchy. So H1's like your page, H2 are maybe categories on the page, and then H3s maybe subsections of those categories. And then H4s, once you start getting in there, it's like, should I be using that still? But it's still to highlight a title or a section inside there. And then once you go down smaller, it's like the use cases go down and down. I have some fundamental issues with the formatting and how they come out of the box, an H1 versus like an H2. But we'll talk about that. So just to show you this, they have some base styling associated with it. So H1, H2. And then any content that's related to description or anything that's relevant to the page, your primary content should be wrapped in a paragraph tag or a P tag. So these are very common to see inside your HTML DOM, so P and then your H1s. But back to where I was. We have the star selector. What this does is I say color. Oh, actually, I'm not going to do color. I'm going to say outline, 1 pix, solid red. Now, outline is an interesting CSS property. It's primarily used for development purposes. And as people build out interfaces, especially very complex frameworks that you're building, I use outline all the time. So it just says outline, 1 pix, solid red. So what this means is an outline. And this is kind of a shorthand code for outline. We'll be talking about some of these examples as we get into units and spacing. But what this is saying is render an outline with 1 pixel that's red, and it's going to be solid. I can make it dashed if I wanted to. And you'll see that this is now dashed around there. Or I can make it blue. But outline, again, is really just used for development purposes. So a lot of times when I'm building out something, I'm using like red, blue, yellow, green, lime to highlight the different sections, just so I have a quick mental state of like where I am, or if I'm talking to someone about some code that I'm writing or some piece of the interface, like let's highlight this section. So there are some use cases for it in building it out, but it's primarily a development helper. Now, the star selector, you can see that's been applied to every single piece of my code here. So it's on the div on the outside, it's on this div on the inside, it's on my H1, it's on my paragraph. So that's what the star selector does. It's kind of like a sledgehammer. I recommend using this very sparingly, but there are its use cases. So let's add a class to here. So to add styles or CSS to my HTML, I add the class attribute. So class equal, and I have quotes. This is where I can start adding my selectors. So just to give you an example, I'll put selector. Now earlier I talked about selectors and classes. So in my CSS I put a period and I put selector. And then I put the curly brackets. And then I put something like color is blue. Actually, I'm going to move this. That's fine. So I have selector here, and I have my color being blue, and it's applied to this div. You'll notice that I don't have the period here. If I put the period here, it's not going to work. But that's how I identify a selector in CSS. Now I can have multiple selectors inside here. And what this will be is a background color of lime, because this is a great color combination. So I can have multiple classes applied to an HTML element. So here I have selector and selector 2. Selector 2 has a background color of lime, and selector has a color of blue. Now you may ask, like, well, why would you have 2 selectors? Couldn't I just be using this here too? It does render the same way. But the reason why you want to break out your selectors and have multiple selectors and apply them to your classes is to separate some of the styling. And that's one of the pieces that we'll be talking about is object-oriented CSS. But the idea here to kind of dig this in your brain early on is to have multiple selectors that have really single use, but can be used in multiple places. For example, let's comment this out. And this is how you comment out in CSS. It's this / star, and then you end with star / here. It's probably really hard to see up there, but it looks like this. So that's commented out. So you'll see that the red's no longer there. So let's say selector, outline red. So now you'll notice that this guy has an outline red. And I'm going to comment this guy out just right now. And I'll leave this one. So this red is being around this div because selector has an outline solid red that's being applied to this div. Now, if I also wanted that to be applied to my paragraph, I could add that selector again. And now my paragraph has that outline red. And let's make this be something else. So now it's a border. If I had this border being applied to selector, but I only wanted them to have that outline red, I could not really do this. So if I just wanted the div to have a blue and red, but I only wanted the paragraph to have the red, I've now applied both those styles to this paragraph tag. This sounds really easy, and this seems like a no-dust type of example, but people do this wrong all the time. And we'll talk about those for sure, but this is why you kind of separate them out as opposed to sharing these properties. And this is kind of like a really silly example because you would never just have one property that's being used, but the concept here is to separate the pieces and use them as you need them. So far, our class is making sense, what they are, and how to apply properties and syntax. Any questions about DOM, HTML? So we're going to quickly ramp up things here. Is everyone still having fun? On a scale of 7 to 14, where are we? Where 7's the best and 14's the worst? How many 7s out there? All right, cool.
You said when you do the dot selector, does it matter that it says selector as long as it matches what you named it at the top? Or does it always have to be?
So this selector,
Yeah.
and this is probably a bad name. Let's change this. Let's say foo, and then let's call this.
It can really be anything.
Yep, it can be anything. Yep, so these guys just need a line. So this will have the same output.
Are there naming conventions when you're doing?
Yeah, and we'll be covering in the methodologies start of next week, some of those, so. And I'll probably even send out some reading ahead of time because they can get complex. Yeah, but they can be anything. And I can have multiple inside here. So say I did want bar to also have that blue color, I can have it like this. So now they both will have it. So I can have multiple selectors that are sharing. Actually, what I want to do is this. So if I wanted them both to have the blue outline, I can add foo here. And the order of this doesn't really matter. So I can switch the order and I still get the same result. These just need a line, but I removed the period, and it's just a class, and classes go inside here. Now, one of the things I talked about earlier was an ID. So an ID is, classes are reused multiple times on a page, but IDs are only one per page. So, for example, if I had like a classic ID is equal to main. Main is one of those names that is, you see it a lot in your applications. Same thing as like ID is equal to app. This is a common used ID. But they're meant for single use. And really why IDs exist are to identify a DOM element to be selected by JavaScript. So for JavaScript, you don't necessarily want to say, hey, select every single element on my page. You may just say, in main, I want to apply some kind of functionality to it, or I want to be inserting data from a backend or a web service or something like that. So that's why you use IDs. They're also a little bit quicker because they're only one on a page, and the browsers recognize an ID for like quick, let's apply it, there's only one on the page. But you still may want to apply some styling to an ID. Even though it's single use, and the idea of CSS is to kind of reuse and extend and add, but you may want to be like our main. Let's give it a background color of yellow. So what this is the hash, and the ID is main, and that's how I've applied the styles for it. Now let's forget everything that I just wrote here, and let's look back at the star selector, because this is where I start off every project. See, that was one of my tangents, but so star, again, is being applied to everything here. I'm going to talk about some specificity and also inheritance of CSS here, but in a few minutes we're going to take a quick break and we'll kind of start back up with that because that's really where we're going to go up a level and kind of go from there. So star selector, what I could also do is star star, and this has the same output, which this is really ridiculous. But one thing that you'll notice is this one does not have the outline anymore. And now if I add it there, it does have it. So what that's saying is every single element inside of every single element, which for that to actually happen, you can't be the root or the top element. So for me to apply that, this is like the biggest sledgehammer out there. Now it's applied to everything plus everything again, so it cascades through twice, these same properties. Fun. But what I typically use this for on every single project is this property. It's box sizing, border box. And what I do is I add to the star selector, and I do a before and an after. And this is awesome. And I'll show you an example of why this is awesome here. Box sizing is a CSS property that was created to help consistency between containers across different browsers using units, so padding and margin. Different browsers render the containers based off of the outside container versus the content container inside of it, this like pseudo container. Sounds confusing. Let me show you an example. This is how you comment out in HTML. Less than, exclamation mark, double dash, greater than. So we have this div. And again, divs are pretty common to be used inside of a website. And I have a paragraph. And I'm just going to say lorem 40. Ooh, lorem 10. And then I'm going to create one that's called demo1. And then I'm going to have demo2, demo3 here. Come on. I'm just getting this set up. That's why I'm moving quick here. Oop. All right, so we have demo 1, demo 2, demo 3. These three guys, I'm going to be adding a outline around it. So they'll all have an outline red. So right here, there's demo 1, there's demo 2, and there's demo 3. So those are three separate classes or three separate selectors. And I'm extending this property of outline is equal to 1 pixel solid red to those three guys. Another way I could have also done this, which is like a shorter hand of it, but not as common, is I could say class, which is my attribute selector. So I could just say anything that has class, apply this, but that probably doesn't work that well. But I could say contains demo dash, and I get the same output. So the value contains demo dash, or I could also have like no, or I could have emo, which would be, I'm going to leave that. But so this is applying those classes with one CSS selector. That's a shorthand to all three of these right there. Another one is I could have it say start with, which this doesn't, but if I had demo, it does have that. And that's in the 30 selectors you must memorize. All right, so back to where I was with box sizing. So let's say we had this container and we wanted it to be 200 pixels wide. So how I define that is width, colon, 200 pixels. And we have 200 pixels here, 200 pixels. This is intentionally a bad example, but I'm reusing these properties. Ideally, we'd be like, all right, how can I reuse these across the board? I could do something like that. But I'm intentionally separating them out for demo purposes here. All three of these, though, I'm going to add a padding of 40 pixels. So padding is on the inside, and then margins on the outside. So I'm going to say margin 20 pixels around it. So now these guys all have 40 pixels and 20 around it. Now, I'm going to get rid of this. So you see how I have this as 200 pixels? How wide do you think this box is? Do you think this is 200 pixels, this red box, or do you think it's something different? If you well, and don't calculate the outline either. But any guesses? Would you think that would be 200 pixels? Okay. So let's do inspect. So inspect, this is Chrome Developer Tools. I live, breathe this every single day. This is the best thing that ever happened to my life. I think literally, like I think like no joke, this may be like in my top 3 best things in my life. Like when Developer Tools came out, so it was Firebug and Firefox that came out, and it was just like, this is awesome. I don't have to I can see how the page is really rendering and inspect it. So how I get there is I can go from the top and say, I have it closed out. I forget how to actually view developer tools, or more easily I can right click and say inspect element, and it'll pop up. And here it kind of highlights everything. So you see that DOM tree here, and then the breakdown of all these elements inside here. And then all my CSS properties apply to it. But we'll be talking about that when we get back from our break. But let's highlight this. And what this says is it says 280 pixels wide. The reason why it's being rendered 280 pixels, even though I defined it as 200, was the 40 padding inside of it. So it's 40 on the left, 40 on the right. 40 plus 40 is 80, plus 200 gives me 280. That is stupid. But it's not, because what it's saying is the inner content here, inside here, is 200 pixels wide. So another thing in Chrome Developer Tools, I say inspect element. When I go to computed, it actually does that box sizing breakdown for me. And I can see my inner content is 200 pixels, my padding here, and then is 40 pixels. It should be somewhere in there, 40. And then if there's a border, that's being calculated, and then the margin around it. So this is right. It's 200 pixels of my content, but my container for it is 280. There's different schools of thought of like, do I do it on the container, on the content? WebKit actually does it on the content and goes outward. Other browsers do it differently. So different browsers have decided to render it differently. So some of them do it outside coming in, and if I actually put 200 pixels, it's going to be defined as it. So let's try to make them all be 200 pixels. This is the wrong way of doing it. All right, so what did I say, 280? I make this 120. So now this guy's 200 pixels. And then this guy is still too big. So I'm trying to think of another way of doing this in this example. But what I can do is I can do box sizing, border box. Right. And then I can also say like box sizing, content box. So for content box, I have to make it 120. Actually, I don't really need the 3 examples, but now these are all 200 pixels. But this one's weird because it is actually being defined as 120 pixels, but that's because the content inside is 120 pixels, but it's 120 plus 80 to give me 200. But this guy is 200 pixels, and it's the outside of the container because I have now applied box sizing border box. And now I have stabilized my containers and the content inside of it, and this will be consistent across all browsers. So when I start a project, I add box sizing border box, and I say add it to every single element, including anything pseudo that's before or after. And now I've applied this to everything, and from moving on to my project, I can define my outer width as 200, and it's going to be consistent across all browsers. So that's how I start every single project. Any questions about that? Cool. All right, we're going to take a really quick break. Unless you guys want to go, I continue cranking through this. I know we only have like a half an hour left, so I meant to take a break a half an hour ago, but whoops. Yeah. Let's just take like a quick little 2-second break here. Does this make sense? This is really, really important when you continue chatting. When it comes to creating containers and understanding that different browsers render things differently is one of the most frustrating things ever. Because you may build it right in Chrome. So I use Chrome. A lot of developers also use Safari. Firefox used to be kind of a go-to. I've seen some people randomly reuse it, start using it again. But most people building interfaces use Chrome and Safari because the developer tools that are associated with them. IE's gotten way better with it, and Edge, but still, my favorite go-to is CodePen. My favorite go-to is Chrome, and that's what I'll be demoing, but they all kind of have their own helpers to it. All right, so we're gonna kind of, what I'll do is I'll keep this one and start a new one. So, what does it say? All right, cool. This is private, so close. Adam, am I still coming through on there? Oh, I disappeared. I could. So there was a good question from Kyle when we had that break. He asked me what the before and after meant, and before I delete that, I'll just show. So this is an anchor or an A tag, and this is how you link two different pages together. So in HTML, if I wanted to say, here's my home page, take me to the About Us section, I could add inside here about.html or whatever file it is. Or if I wanted to link to something like my favorite site, google.com, I could link this so it goes to Google. And then there's different attributes I could have inside here, like target blank, which this would open it up in a new window. And that's typically what you do for external sites. But getting to the question, I have this selector, anchor. So I create the class, anchor, curly brackets. And this before and after is the pseudo class. So anything with a colon is referred to as a pseudo class. And I can apply additional styling to it. So for my anchor, I'm going to say text decoration none, which is going to remove that underline. And to show another example of a pseudo class, I'm going to add a hover. And it's going to turn into red. So when I hover over anchor, it turns red. So that's what a pseudo class does. And it's only applied to anchor. So anchor colon hover means that's what's happening. There's different ones for anchors, but that's a very common one to use.
Before and after, or those pseudo classes.
So before and after is another example of it. And why these are really cool is I can add the CSS property called content, which only works on before and after. So it's a really weird, unique CSS property, but it's meant for adding elements to, or design elements to your page that you don't want to add to your actual markup or DOM. So something like this. Like the traditional, like, yeah, here's an anchor, you know, but I don't want that actually in my HTML. So when you're writing your HTML and CSS, you only want to put markup that's related to how you're going to be portraying the content that's there and not stylistic things. Can you still hear me? What? Oh, really? That's been happening lately. I'll fix that later. So I could also do something like this and greater than and add it inside here, which gives me that look. But then if my branding or styles ever changed, or I had different ways I wanted to maybe make this anchor look, I've now committed a hard code change just for a stylistic thing. So why before and after is really great in that content attribute is I can do something like this, or I can change it to be like this if I wanted to. It just gives me more flexibility. And I can style these separately. So I can make this be like red, and then on the hover, it kind of aligns. So it's just really cool. And I can do a before and after.
So why would you want to do that in CSS, not just HTML?
If your brand changes, and anything stylistic that doesn't relate to the content you don't want there. So like something like this, that's purely stylistic. But it's also something you can do more complex things. So I can make it blank, and I can just say like display, inline block. Let's say this. Whoa. So I don't know, something like this dot afterwards, like that's a stupid example, but there may be some reason why I want to use something like that. But I could do like a z-index, -1 pixel, position relative, and move this guy. Actually, I'm going to do absolute, sorry. Just to give this example like real meaning to it. Whoa. And this is my favorite part about like CSS is like there's so many things you have to do just to show a little example. But here I've added this like red in the background, you know, that maybe is part of like more of my branding, something like that. That's purely stylistic, and you can get really creative. You can create these elements and these design things like a circle in the background that isn't necessarily just content based. So I can actually create these elements and designs from it. Does that answer your question? Okay. So those are anchors. And that's why you do the before and after, because that same spacing is applied and different browsers render it differently. All right, now getting into inheritance and specificity. So how many of you have ever heard of inheritance or know what inheritance is in CSS? How many of you have ever heard of specificity? Cool. These are the fundamentals of CSS. And let me show you a plain example of inheritance. We have body, and we're going to say color red. So there's a visual aspect of it, of how inheritance works. But then there's also a selector aspect of it. So the font here is being rendered as red. Let's also change it to a serif font, a sans serif font. So now my font isn't just on the body, like where you would think that if I was just typing here, it would be red and be that font color, but it's actually cascading through. Now what I can also do is to show you one of my elements here. I could use a type selector like a div, which type selector should be used very, very sparingly. So type selectors are looking at the element that, you know, instead of looking at a class or an ID, it's looking at this div and it's applying it to all my divs.
Why do you want to use it sparingly?
What?
Why would you want to use it sparingly?
Just because they set really hard rules. So for me to say, like, I want all my divs to be red, color red, and then I add a class to override that color red, then I'm going to be having these conflicts of properties. And the idea of CSS is to always be extending as opposed to overriding. So they should be used primarily just for resets and normalizing, which we'll talk about that as we go through some more examples. So here's the div. Here's main. Main is cascading through. Again, I don't have content just in main. I have just this DOM tree of a paragraph and an H1 and these colors being applied to it. So if I right-click and I go to inspect, and I look at my main, so I highlight this here. My ID selector right here is main, and I have a color red, font family sans serif. And over here, you see the properties applied to it. Another really awesome thing about Chrome Developer Tools. And this is the same thing in Safari. And as I highlight different things, it will bring up other things. Now, remember the star selector is applied to everything. So I can see that P has box sizing border box attached to it. But then I also see H1 has that attached to it. And I also see foobar has that star. Because remember, that is saying every single element inside my DOM tree gets this property attached to it. Now, why this is red is if I scroll down, and it says inherited from div main. There's different properties that cascade through and inherit. So font properties are one of them, like color being red. If I apply it to my root, even if so my root element is my HTML, or it's the parent wrapper inside a directive, but in common terms, it's going to be your HTML file, your HTML tag. So it's going to inherit all the way through. So what this says is why this is red is main was defined as red, and it's inherited into this guy here. And if I selected even my P tag here, and I went down, and I scroll here, and it says inherited from main, it's red. So color does this, font families does this, font size does it. So if I wanted to make this update, I want all my font to be red. I can do it in HTML, and I want it to be sans serif. So a lot of times you apply this as a first step in a project. Body's a pretty common place to put this, like my font family. If I wanted to do Arial, actually define it as a font, I could do that. And then my fallback is sans serif. And then if I wanted to say like something like main, color blue. Now this became blue. But then I could have something like div ID is equal to footer. So I have my footer here, and this is red. This is, we need a new projector. But this is red, and this is blue up here. Why this is red is I inspect, and I go to footer, and it's red, it's Arial, and it's being inherited from body. Footer's the same way. So anything inside there, because I haven't overwritten it, is going to inherit down. Now, while we look at main and it's blue, you'll see this, color blue. So everything inside of main now has the color blue being inherited through it. So this is blue. And you'll notice that it says inherited from main blue. And I go to ID main. Sounds very repetitive, but it says color blue. This is really, really important. And this is the fundamental of CSS and how it works. Now, one other thing I'm going to call out. And I said CSS, and I'll say this multiple times. CSS is a language of extending as opposed to overwriting. There are use cases when you overwrite. And by overwriting, I mean like this color blue. So we have the color blue, but you'll notice that it still says inherited red. Do you see this slash through this? This slash means that I've overwritten it. Now what you want to avoid is this as much as possible. But there's 2 times where it's more than appropriate to have these slashes. And it's from inheritance or if you've increased specificity. Actually, not from that. Well, there's different cases. The first one I'm going to talk about is inheritance from something that I've defined or from the user agent. So this is OK that I have this cross through because it says inherited by. Now, where it would be bad is I have div, and I have color, red, line. So this goes back to your question, like the type selectors. So I have div as line. But I've defined main to be blue. And now I look at inspect elements. This is not good, because I was expecting everything to be blue. But here I have main, I still see that it's being blue, so I'm overriding the div color, but it's blue, but this is green, and I'll show you why it's green. But this slash through is not good to be there. And this is one of those things that a lot of people don't understand, because what they just do is they will increase specificity to make sure that that happens. And I'll show you an example of that in just a moment. So blue is is the definition of what main ID is. Div is the color, which is on the type selector of div. And then we have inherited color red from body, but it's being rendered as green. This is fundamental, like CSS and using Chrome developer tools, and why it's my favorite thing in the world. All right, why this is green? We go down a level, and we see that this guy is now defined as lime. And then if we look at this H1, we will see that it says inherited from div lime. But you'll start seeing like all these slashes through, so this code's getting really messy, and it really shouldn't be. So you want to be avoiding these as much as possible. The only time to do it is on inherited and on the user agent, and I'll show you an example of the user agent here in just a moment. So far, is this making sense?
You looking at me?
Yeah. All right. Is anyone? What?
It'll always inherit the closest thing to it.
Yeah, it's the parent container that's going to be inheriting from. And then it's going to inherit and kind of cascade those styles. Now, I'm going to show you an example of why, kind of back to Rachel's question too. Let's look at this. We have this H1. H1s have this weird spacing on the top. And where do those come from? They come from the defined browser spec that are defined by Chrome. The people that develop specs and drafts for the browser, they say all H1s have a margin of 1em at the start of it and 1em at the end of it, or whatever it is, so it's 0.7 ems. And it also has a font size of 2ems. So every element has these predefined CSS properties attached to them. And then this gets really important as you try to do resets and alignment of your code. So here we have H1, and you'll notice it says user agent style sheet. So the user agent style sheet means it's the browser. This is what Chrome is rendering this. And these are pretty consistent across every single browser. So first step is, well, how do I change these? Do I want to change them? In most cases, you do want to change them to create a consistent interface. So one of the things people may do is, let's create a reset on my H1s. H2s, H3s, because all of them have the same thing. H4, 5, 6. And I go here, and I say, well, what's styling that? All right, this WebKit margin before, I could copy it. And after, and I can say 0 and 0. So now I've removed that margin top and bottom and reset those H1s. The same thing with my paragraph tag, which is right here, have those predefined. If I wanted to reset those across the board, I could. And I could just add that here. So now they're all kind of reset, and there's no spacing in between them. I could also do something like a reset on the font sizes and say they're all 1 rem. So now all my font sizes are the same. So if I look at this, my H1 here, you can see that I have this WebKit margin before and WebKit margin after as 0. And if I scroll down here, you'll see my user agent has these slashes through. So that's the other example of where you want to see the slashes. It's from the user agent, or so where the browser has defined the CSS properties and how you're going to be kind of overriding them here, because you're really just defining them for the first time. And what I want to do here on like the type selectors is create a reset for my overall project. And you, again, want to be sparingly defining like your type selectors, like your H1 through H6. If you're going to add some kind of style to it or a property, you want to make sure that that's going to be across the full project. So anywhere where I have an H1 or H2, I don't want it to have that margin top. I don't want it to have that margin bottom. I don't want it to be something like I want it to be the color red, because most likely that's not going to be the case. It's going to be something more like a reset, like the margin spacing and the units associated with it. So this is a good slash truth. This is from the user agent. And this is the overriding of it and the definition of it, of the H1. Now, let's look at something really awesome. Someone say a really good word. I don't have to spell that. A short word. Bunny. And then this one will be funny. And this will be funny bunny. Cool. So we have a couple of different properties here. I'm going to add some selectors down here. Before I do this, I'm going to clear this up. So all my font is red. Let me show you again how I know where that came from. I say inspect, and I go to my P, and I look, and I say, where is that red coming? Oh, it's coming inherited from body. So where does body get defined? It's right here, color red, Arial. And then if I go here, look at my CSS, color red. If I wanted to change that, I could do that here. Now, we're going to look at some inheritance from CSS and also the specificity for it. And we'll be using bunny, funny, funny, bunny. So let's say I wanted to target foo, funny, and I'm going to make it be color black. So anything that is inside foo and it has a class funny is now black. Now look what happens when I move funny bunny outside of foo, and we put it here. It is now still red. So these guys, and I'll highlight foo. I'll put an outline of 10 pixels. Oops. Just so you can see the difference. That's lime. So this guy inside here is foo. So the container for this content is foo. Inside of foo, we have, inside of foo, we have funny. I think that's what it was, right? Yeah, we have funny. And I'm saying anything that has the class funny inside of foo, make it black. These guys are also funny, but they're not inside of foo. So that's why they're red. So let's also highlight funny. You know what's funny is italic fonts. Now they're funny. So now I have anything that's funny is italic, but only black inside of foo, which is inside the screen wrapper. So what that is referred to is as specificity, but it's also in it's specificity in targeting these kind of elements inside of each other. So here we have foo. Again, we go back to my DOM tree, and we have foo, which is defined right here. So it's a class applied to a class attribute. Inside that, we have funny, which is a child node or element of foo, and it has a class funny. And you can see right here we have foo funny. And what this is doing is it's saying right here, if funny is inside of foo, make it black. And that's the CSS property for it. So it's not looking at foo and then funny. It's saying this is the actual order of where it would be inside my DOM. Now I could also change it to something like main. So I could say any funny that's inside of main, also make it black. And I get that same result. Now I could say make anything that's funny inside body black, and now they're both black. So all this is doing is kind of targeting from a parent selector to a child selector inside of it. Now what I can also do is add higher specificity to it or targeting. So if I did something like this greater sign is saying anything that is funny that's directly inside of foo, make it black. So this is an absolute path inside the DOM tree. So foo is directly within, funny is directly within foo. So we look back at my DOM. Look how funny. That was a really good word. That's what you said, right, Bunny? Yeah, that's awesome. So funny is directly inside of foo. So here, and that's the path for it. So it's getting applied. Now if I added another wrapper around the second funny, let's just put div. Oops. Did not mean to do it here. So we have this guy, and I'm just going to add a div and put the paragraphs inside here. This last guy is no longer black. Only this guy's black. And the reason for that is I highlight him. Funny. Funny is being inherited from body, which is defined as red. But the parent of it is a div, not a foo. But if I look at funny here, and why this is going to be black is because it's a direct path from foo. So funny is directly within foo, which is this parent right here. So you see those two right there. This to that. Now, that's referred to as specificity, and I'll show you kind of an example of it. But then I can also increase specificity by adding something like main, which is going to give me the same result here. This is kind of an unnecessary example, but I can also increase it even more by adding more selectors inside there. Mm-hmm.
So it looked like originally when you did .foo.funny and it applied to whatever funny was inside of foo. Why do you need the caret there?
So the case of why I want the caret is I just want to target the ones that are directly inside of foo. So this one has a wrapper around it, and maybe in my DOM structure, right now we're kind of looking at this linear. So if this was an actual structure or design, like a grid column, this may be positioned over here, and maybe my main content I want to be black, but my sidebar I want it to be red. So in the case of that, why I add that direct, like that caret and say like this direct path, is because anything inside the sidebar I don't want to be black. I just the main.
If you didn't have the caret, anything that was wrapped that was within foo would get the same treatment.
Yep. So just to show you, like getting rid of this, now it's going to be, they're both black. So this is looking at everything inside there. And then I could also get rid of this. Yeah. So this has higher specificity. This is going to be probably another thing that may sound really confusing. So this is also back to that video that we were talking about. And this is why CSS is really easy to learn. Like, who says they know like what a class and how to write some properties are? Like, just quick show of hands. Do you know what a class is and like how to? All right, so you know CSS and HTML, so you can probably like write all your projects. And that's what people think. Like, it is super easy to learn, but this is the really difficult piece. So what I'm going to try to do here is show you this example. Let's get rid of this right now. And we have funny again. It's all red. We have this div wrapper right here around funny bunny. So I want anything funny to be blue. right? We're going to apply it here. But then we decide that we want everything inside here to be, we want it to be green. So now we have funny, foo, and we want it to be color lime. So now these are going to be lime. This is kind of back to where we were. Now let's look at our code here. The code outside here is going to have the color being blue. And we'll see that the user agent has it inherited as red, but we see that slash through. But then we define it as funny as being color blue, and it's italic. And then we look at here, and what I've done is I've increased specificity, meaning that anything inside of, any funny that's inside of foo is now color lime. And I've overwritten funny. This is an example of a slash through of using increasing specificity to kind of get the results that I want. If this happens early on in the project, it's really bad. This is something that you should be avoiding doing. Again, CSS is a language of extending, not overriding. And here I've overwritten the definition of funny being blue to being lime. Now, if this was something like another property, as opposed to it being overriding the color lime, say I wanted this to be font, weight, bold. This would be a great example of using specificity and the selectors that you have to extend the styling. So here, they're both blue, so funny's blue. They're both italic because we've defined it as anything that's funny to have the font style italic, and it's hilarious, and their color is blue. But then anything that's inside that's funny and inside of foo is a font weight of bold. So I've increased specificity and targeted these specifically to extend stylistic things without overwriting. Now let's go back to color, lime. 3 months go by, there's thousands of lines of CSS. It's a stormy day. That's the scene. And someone says, well, we don't want that to be green anymore. And then someone's like, I know CSS. And they say, okay, let's do funny. That's the class. Let's make it purple. They're like, no, it's still green. And they do this. And they're like, okay, we fixed it. And so you can add an important, and that overrides it. Important's like the worst thing to use. And then someone does a quick code check, and they're like, no, don't do that. I know CSS. I know how to fix this. They're like, okay. So that guy's purple. We're going to say foo. And then it's kind of like this example back here. And someone's like, that's great. 3 months later go by, and the code's like really, really long. And someone's like, no, we're going to go back to lime. Okay. They're like, that sounds great. But no, let's say they're like, oh, we're going to go back to lime. And they're like, they put it up here. So I just said foo funny is lime. Okay, then we're going to go back and say important. Now it's lime. But then again, someone's like, don't ever use important, so they get rid of it. And then they look at Chrome Developer Tools, and they say inspect. And they say, okay, I define that as foo funny. And it's saying purple. And then I look at foo funny and it's saying color is lime. And then I'm looking here and it says foo funny is color lime. Why isn't it lime? But it's actually defined as blue and it should be inheriting red. This is how most projects look. Now, how CSS works, it works from top to bottom. And the higher specificity is going to win on top of it. So if I added main here, it's going to be green. So I've increased specificity that allows this guy to win. But again, if you weren't doing a code review, you would also see that I am color lime, I'm overriding purple, I'm overriding the color that I want it to be, and I'm overriding blue. And this is a very common issue with CSS. But you can see how easily I can get the results that I want. Now browsers, this may not seem that important to you, but browsers hate this. And the more and more you do this is going to affect the performance of your actual page. There's not just perceived value, but physical, the way that the page scrolls, the way that it renders and loads, and the overall order of it. The more and more you do this, it's going to be really horrible. But the worst part is the nightmare of updating this. All right, so let's remove the specificity. And then someone also brilliant says, well, they're like, why isn't it lime? They're like, you put it at the top of your CSS. And they're like, OK, I'll put it at the bottom. And now it's going to be lime. And again, this is because CSS reads from top to the bottom of your actual document, of your CSS document. So the lower it is in your CSS document is who's going to win. And now this guy, even though it has the same selector name, it's really the order. So let's just toggle back and forth and say, think of a color, orange. So right here, this is orange, but then that's lime. But if I switch it here, it's now going to be orange. So you can see that the actual order of your CSS directly affects it. But then what doesn't matter is if I increase specificity, the higher the specificity is going to win, even if it's afterwards. So specificity always wins. And then if these guys are now equal to the same specificity and they have increased specificity, it's the sort order that matters. And those are like the cascading effects of CSS, is it goes from top to bottom and then increasing specificity. Ideally, there is what's referred to as the inception rule, that you should never go 4 selectors deep. In my mind, I feel like you should never go more than 2 selectors deep, and those should only be contextually based. You know, like the example of making it bold inside of here is an okay example of it, but they should not be stylistic. So that's some really quick covering of inheritance, specificity, and issues with CSS. And what I'm going to do is kind of clear this up. And I'm going to remove the bad versions of these guys. So kind of getting this back to where we were. So you guys don't have a reference to bad code here. This is cool. We'll get rid of this. So this is an example of just like CSS, specificity, inheritance, and some of the cascading effects of CSS. And you can play with this, but it's just using colors for this. I know that was a lot to cover in that last half an hour, but we are now over. So if anyone wants to stick around and ask questions, or if anyone has any quick questions right now, let me know. But we'll review this. I'll send this out, and I'll send you also some really nice reading about CSS, inheritance, cascading. But this is the most important piece of CSS, is not just the syntax of it, but understanding the order of it, of inheritance, specificity, and cascading effects of CSS. So that's it. Any questions about this? Or did I lose you guys towards the end there?
So why these always overall classes?
Good question. All right, so let's add an ID here. Let's do another one. So you can say funny, bunny. This is where that demo was actually going, but Adam gave me the signal that was over time. So this is 2 selectors that are combined together. There's no space in between them. So this guy has higher specificity. So anything that has funny and bunny together, I've tagged them together. So that's increased specificity. But then if I have an ID of pizza, and I say color is blue, it actually has higher specificity, and it also doesn't matter the order of it. IDs do win. Yeah, that was actually one that I didn't know until recently. Someone asked me that question. And I was like, I don't know, because I rarely use IDs.
Is there a guide to specificity hierarchy?
One of the things we'll be covering is CSS, start of the next class, which covers just the idea of the cascading effects of it. But specificity it's similar to like the rules around like type selectors. It should be used sparingly. It does happen in projects. But like the ones that will win, of course, is important. But that's on the property, not the actual selector. So important always wins. 2 importance competing against each other needs to have higher specificity. IDs win. The longer the selector is, and I mean longer as in not the length of your class names, but how many different selectors that you have in there are going to win. All right, cool. Well, thank you guys. I really, really appreciate you coming in on a Saturday morning and being a part of Columbus Web Group. And please do not hesitate to provide me feedback. I prefer positive feedback because I'm really, that's fine. But negative feedback is actually what I'm really looking for, or if there's anything that you didn't get out today, or if you didn't like the format of this, let me know. One of the things is I wanted to have more hands-on today, so where we're going to start off in the next one is you guys actually getting into some of the code and starting off with some of these basics. And I feel like we covered this really quickly at the end, but hopefully you learned something new today. But please send me feedback, and I'll be sticking around here if you have some questions. Cool. Thanks.